Hello and welcome to our 9th episode of the unofficial SAP on Azure video podcast. Today is September 11th, and together with Robert and Goran, we are here to talk about anything related to SAP on Azure. Today we have Etienne Dittrich as our special guest, and a few weeks ago he had published 2 really interesting blogs about global deployments and related considerations out of this. So we'll switch over to him in a minute. But before that, as always, let's quickly take a look at what happened this week. So welcome, everyone.
Welcome.
Let me actually quickly share my screen. So we have identified a few topics again that were released this week. Actually, just 2 days ago, we announced the automatic VM guest patching for Windows virtual machines in Azure. So basically, we can now, this is currently in private preview, not in private, in public preview, but the idea is basically that we look for missing critical or security related patches for your Windows machines, and then you can opt in and apply these patches automatically during off-peak hours. So we just had a discussion. Obviously, we don't want to do this for a productive SAP system. We don't want you to patch the application layer or whatever where your SAP systems are running on Windows. But I still think this, especially for, I don't know, your sandbox systems or maybe some non-critical development systems or other infrastructures that maybe are not so critical from a operational point of view. I think this can still help a lot to make sure that you have your Windows always on the latest patches that are available. So it's in preview, check it out and provide feedback. Good, the next thing that I want to highlight is there's a new openSAP course that started this week. So Martin Krashoff and Carsten Trothmann are talking about the SAP Cloud Platform extension suite. I think it's a 1 week content. It's a total effort of, no, it's actually 4 weeks. It's open for 4 weeks, but it's roughly 3 to 6 hours of content. I'm not fully through with it, but I really liked the introduction and talking about how you extend your SAP systems, why you extend your SAP systems. And I think this can really be also interesting in the context of the SAP and Microsoft integration, because obviously a lot of concepts that we see here in leveraging the extension suite can not only be used for extending your SAP systems with SAP services using the SAP Cloud Platform or the Business Technology Platform, but obviously we can also use this then to leverage Azure functionalities, in extend your SAP solutions to Teams, to Office, and so on, to the Power Platform. So I think there are really some very interesting concepts in this openSAP course. So I can only recommend to check this one out as well.
One question: what happened with your planned openSAP course about SAP on Azure? You planned to have something.
So unfortunately, the course was postponed. I mean, it's still there. You can still register, but we needed to postpone the course. So hopefully we'll have it back on track soon again.
Okay.
Good. The next thing that was published this week is another insight on monitoring SAP solutions end-to-end on Azure. And I think we mentioned this a few times before. Microsoft is obviously a huge customer of SAP. And what I really love about our, not Microsoft IT department, but the Microsoft Core Services, Engineering and Operations department is that they really share a lot of best practices. So whether it's an Office rollout that is happening within Microsoft, or whether it's how to run Teams, there were some nice blogs right now, how we reacted to COVID-19 and stuff like that. So what I really love about our organization there is that they really share their best practices, what worked well, what doesn't work well. And in this blog, they talk in detail about how they work with monitoring SAP solutions on Azure. So they provide some really interesting statistics. So here we have this 70 terabyte highly compressed database that is used for our ERP, for our central ERP system. A lot of other information, and then they talk a little about how they go ahead and monitoring this environment. And basically, they're doing this in 4 layers. So they really say, well, we need to monitoring the business process layer, the SAP application layer, the infrastructure layer, and the web services layer. And with this concept, they make sure that they collect all the relevant telemetry information. So we're using Azure Monitor Log Analytics or the Log Analytics agents there to really collect and capture the data. Here we have more than 900 virtual machines on Azure that make up here our whole Microsoft or SAP estate. Then once we have the information, then in Log Analytics we can do alerting. We can obviously build dashboards, reports on this. So we have historical reports where we can evaluate certain trends that are happening there. We're also obviously doing real-time monitoring there. So where we have some Power BI dashboards, how to do really real-time analytics on the situation with the SAP environment. So I think it's a really interesting blog that talks about how our teams are working with an SAP environment. So yeah, I think it's definitely worth reading through it.
Yeah, they are really advanced department. I mean, doing their own small development basically of those kind of stuff and running. So really valuable insight.
Are you planning to share some GitHub
yeah,
stuff?
So would be of value.
Yeah.
We need to ask them. Yeah.
Okay, maybe we can have a dedicated one session just for that part, just to show the people what we are actually using, how we are using. I think also ABAP SDK is one part of that solution also. So maybe we can dedicate just one of the session or invite someone from that team.
So we actually already, I mean, Hans Reuter, he also already, we had some discussions and he might hopefully join our podcast at 1 week. But I fully agree. I think this would be extremely valuable. I know Hans, he's really fantastic and he can share so many insights and from what is really happening within the SAP environment at Microsoft. So I really hope that we can have him on the show soon, so he can really share his insights there.
Great. Okay.
One other news when we switch sites that was just released today, and I think especially right now, this is really interesting and good to read. So Jürgen Müller and Thomas Saueressig, they just released a blog or this news article that they really want to take a closer look at the terminology used within SAP. So this whole master-slave, whitelist, blacklist discussions, and they really talk about that just using the language has obviously a huge impact on how we perceive the inclusiveness or whatever you might call this here. So I think it's a great approach. I mean, this is really apparently SAP wide, that there's now this guidance that SAP should not use terms like master slave and whitelist, blacklist, and so on. I think, or I had there was a blog post or a YouTube video from Scott Hanselman some time back where he also outlined the steps, for example, how in GitHub you can change from the master branch to the main branch and stuff like that. So I think SAP is taking here a really strong step forward and clearly saying, well, this is now the official guidelines within SAP to address at least some of these issues that are currently happening. So I think that's a pretty strong move, and yeah, let's see what happens there going forward.
Yeah, nice.
Then two more things, two events. I mean, we talked about Ignite already in the past. I hope all of you have registered. I'm not sure if we are allowed to share some of the numbers, but I can assure you we have thousands of registrations already. So I think this is going to be really a fantastic event again. And now the session catalog is available. So if you go to myignite.microsoft.com, I mean, you don't even need to register, but you can just go there and browse the catalog. There are hundreds of sessions available. So just take a look what might be interesting for you. Select them, put them on your schedule, and I hope to see you there. Is a little complicated because we'll all be virtual, but I'm really looking forward to this. I think there will be again some really fantastic sessions happening.
So let's meet in the cloud,
Let's meet in the cloud. Yes, let's have a team session then. One last thing for the German-speaking audience, we'll have a Microsoft Theme Day. I'm not sure how to translate it. On October 1st, we'll have a really great lineup of speakers again. So Hans Reuter, the guy that we talked about just before, will have a presentation there, and I think attending just for this is worth it already. So you can register here. We have presentations from partners. So Share, Robert Müller from Share is talking about why using Azure makes sense. There's some other speakers there. We have Christian Lechner is talking about how to use the Azure platform using Azure functions, the serverless technologies. So maybe also related to this extension platform in the openSAP course that we just mentioned before. So I think this is also something really interesting. And then obviously, we also have Markus Sommer from Microsoft talking about this or at this event. So I think if you are in Germany or in German-speaking regions, then definitely check this out as well. Good. With this, I think we're done for the weekly recap, and now I want to hand over more or less to Etienne. So before switching over, Etienne, he has really published some very interesting, very insightful blog posts. So typically when we work with SAP customers, or a lot of SAP customers really have these global deployments. They're not operating only in one country, but really are spread all across the world. And then obviously there are a lot of questions. How do I do these global deployments? Which regions should I select to deploy my SAP environments? And obviously there is a lot of information out there, and I think what Etienne did is he in a beautiful way collected all this information and created some beautiful blogs out of it, and has, I think, also some additional information that he can share with us now. So Etienne, first of all, welcome to this podcast. Thank you very much for joining. Also, thank you very much for joining late on a Friday evening. Let's switch over to you, and maybe you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, look, no problem whatsoever. Just want to say, Holger, Goran, and Robert, thank you very much for having me here. My name's Etienne Dittrich. I work for Microsoft in the strategic partnerships team, and very much a technologist by trade, looking after SAP workloads. So, great introduction by Holger there. Some kind words around the blogs, but look, I think Holger got the point right at the start. Is when you look at SAP as an application. You typically see customers run that with a global user base. There are some concepts such as a single global instance where customers could, for example, really kind of consolidate their business processes in more of a centralized manner, and that brings a lot of challenges with it from a business transformation perspective. But I've taken a bit of a different angle here and said, look, I'm not going to dive a lot into what the typical challenges are that customers will face when they want to revamp their business processes to follow such a centralized model. I took a view and said, what are the challenges our customers will face from a technology perspective? And that was something I've been mulling around for some time. The story started probably 3 years ago, Holger. That's when I first met you. I was at a boot camp when I just joined Microsoft, and as part of the hands-on lab, the first learning I took from that day was, whenever you start an Azure design, you start with a region strategy. That's the most basic format of any kind of Azure design. So region strategy has always been very pertinent in my view. But there are so many challenges when you look at SAP, because we've got more than 50 odd regions. We have availability zones. We've got data centers. It gets really complex for everybody to understand. So I thought I'd simplify this to an extent using the construct of a global user base or a global instance for SAP to see what are the key things that customers need to evaluate when they choose a region and define their region strategy. And then I also touched on some of the technologies that you find in Microsoft Azure that can help or facilitate that process and actually bring together that global construct to that global user base very seamlessly. So once I started formulating these high-level ideas, at the back of my mind, I was always wondering, how can we actually quantify this? So usually customers work through business cases, and there's various types of evaluation criteria that they go through, and certain things are more important to certain customers. So as a logical technologist, I've always been very fond of Pew's decision-making matrix, where you can take a few criteria, you can weigh them up and give them scoring, and then at the end of the day, you get a fantastic model that says, well, this is a justified and quantified decision that I'm making.
Perfect.
So to that extent, I'm just going to run you guys through this view to try and summarize the blog, and I will encourage everybody who hasn't yet viewed the blog to go and read it for a little bit more detail. But imagine you are a global company, you're implementing S/4HANA, you're going to run kind of a central finance operations, but you're going to have users and systems scattered all over the world. One of the questions you've got to ask early on is, which Azure region is best suited to my needs? But for you to be able to understand that question in its own right, you need to understand what, in fact, is an Azure region. For us, at Microsoft, we kind of split the world into geographies. Now, these geographies are kind of a geopolitical boundary, and they kind of follow the atlas or the map. So we talk about the Americas, about Europe, and we talk about Southeast Asia, Asia, and Australasia as geographies. Within those geographies, obviously, there are regions. Those regions are often bound by geopolitical borders, data sovereignty requirements, and all those kind of things. A region at a technical level, obviously, we see that as a latency envelope, and often our regions are paired, which means that customers can actually start building in a business continuity model that makes use of things like true disaster recovery through data replication natively built into Azure. So once you've got a little bit of an understanding of what a region is, I think it's important to understand that it's not just I am headquartered in Europe, I need to run my SAP systems in Europe. There's a lot of things we need to consider. And for our global customers, things like data residency and security is a key input. Yeah. A lot of our customers, have got operations in China, which has challenges in its own right when it comes to data sovereignty. So the things you need to consider there is clearly what are your own country-specific or geo-specific restrictions, or as a company, you might have very secure policies or data privacy agreements internally that kind of shapes where you can or cannot run systems from, or where data can be accessed from. Of course, you can also evaluate things like business continuity, and some customers mandate that there needs to be certain distances between data centers. Others are not perhaps as keen on having distance between data centers, and they might opt for something like a metropolitan level DR solution. Of course, SAP is such a chatty application, so connectivity in these global instances are often key. But it's not just the network performance, it extends to things like latency, network security, kind of bandwidth and throughput that you need to evaluate for those SAP solutions. And then perhaps something not as widely known is when we look at an Azure region and we want to recommend something for a customer. In the SAP on Azure space, one of the first filters we apply on that region selection, because as I said, we have many, many regions out there, but only a subset of those regions would be SAP aware. Now, I use the term SAP aware pretty loosely, but fundamentally what that means is, look, we want to run on certified capabilities. Our infrastructure needs to be, for example, certified for SAP HANA workload, or potentially have SAP's ratings if you want to run a NetWeaver-based system. With that, there are different storage technologies such as Azure NetApp Files and UltraDisk. All of these are kind of building blocks that make that data center or Azure region SAP aware. So I'll explain a bit later, but you start off with all of the Azure regions and then you apply your first filter, which will be that SAP certified building blocks, because there's no point in running an SAP system in an unsupported or uncertified configuration. Then to a lesser extent, the customer's business model has quite a big impact on how they deploy using Azure in a global sense. For example, the more customers that are moving towards a centralized business model will have a single system accessed by everyone else, but other customers still operate in regional capacities and have a bit more of a decentralized model. And then I just want to conclude this one by saying, yes, there are pricing variations across Azure regions. In the cloud wars we face today, TCO is always one of those areas where customers are building their business cases. Now, if you are a customer with global operations, you need to understand that you can literally run your SAP solution in any Azure region. And for those who are a little bit more cost conscious, you could potentially look at some of the US regions. Mm-hmm. There's no real hard or fast rule here, but there's a bit of a rule of thumb that I use as an example sometimes. If you pay $1 for an Azure virtual machine in Europe, you could expect to pay approximately 80 cents in the US and approximately $1.20 in the Asia regions. Now, each region will obviously differ. You can look at all of the Azure pricing calculators and you can quantify that yourself. But if you understand that if you move from the west to the east, the pricing of Azure does kind of increase over time. So once you've got your kind of high-level criteria, it's time to kind of look a little bit deeper into which regions are right for you. But when we talk about SAP and we talk about the technology stack, there's a couple of guiding principles that I always abide by, and one of these super important things is when it comes to end user connectivity, whether through the SAP GUI or through Fiori or any other form of HTTP-based web access to SAP. There's a great wiki on SCN that actually talks about some of those minimum expected latencies from an end user perspective. And look, the lower your latency, the better your user experience is going to be. But this kind of guiding principle was fed directly into the blog because we use some of these benchmarks and KPIs to actually measure end user latencies from various locations of our customers all over the world. And then we can color code those regions. So say, for example, a customer has users in Singapore, in Frankfurt, and in New York, and they evaluate all of the regions possible. They could use something like azurespeed.com at a very basic level just to kind of gauge that proximity in terms of latency to all of the Azure regions out there. And then when it comes to the second guiding principle is we do not veer away from the truth. And as with any SAP implementation, whether you do it on premise or whether you go in the cloud, whether you run a single global instance or multiple regional instances, you have to size your front end. Here, the guiding principle is very, very straightforward. We use the official SAP front end network requirements sizing guide, and we complement that with SAP Note 2240-690 if a customer has a lot of Fiori apps because there's a little bit of overhead on the wire. So what does that all mean for us in terms of, okay, now we have an idea of we can do some things to understand which Azure region is best for us. But that Azure region that we choose at the end of the day will need a little bit of help, because you will always find a remote office on a 2 meg ISDN line or something like that. And there's always going to be somebody that's going to struggle. Not everybody or every customer has got SD-WAN implemented and have got a global footprint. So to that extent, the blog addresses some of these key cool utilities that we can actually use to facilitate that process and make that user experience a lot easier. But in terms of what we're trying to achieve really is look, I think this says it best. We want to make sure that every SAP on Azure end user has the best experience possible, but it's not just end user connectivity. We also want to make sure that those critical business processes that rely on tightly knit interfaces can execute appropriately. And at the end of the day, we want to keep network latency as low as possible for every user interaction or system interface, regardless of where they reside geographically. So now we ask, where are my users? What regions shall I use? And is there a lot of legislation that says I can't do that? Just to talk a little bit about some of these kind of cool utilities that help us in the Azure world. Azure Content Delivery Networks is something fantastic. See it as an Uber caching engine that is fully supported in the Fiori landscape, so that you actually bring static content closer to users. Dynamic content will always be a little bit interactive. Then often overlooked is our connectivity patterns, such as ExpressRoute, obviously allowing high throughput, low latency connections to Azure regions. But in every Azure region, there is the glue that holds every Azure region together is that Azure backbone. So the Azure backbone can be piggybacked on by any customer through just a basic technology such as VNet peering. So I could, for example, run a virtual network in the West Coast of the US where I run my productive SAP system, but I can have a user in Singapore connecting to a local ExpressRoute point of presence and then use that route across the Microsoft backbone through peering those two virtual networks. That then takes out a lot of unnecessary hops and latency points from the user location to the backend SAP system. So kind of the follow-on or the evolution of our network peering approach is that now Azure Virtual WAN, which has the concept of virtual WAN hubs, which are locationally or geographically close to customers' head or branch offices, and that has got a built-in peering relationship. So through Azure Virtual WAN, you can quite happily have a user somewhere in South Africa connect to an SAP system in the Netherlands without having to spend thousands and thousands, potentially millions and millions of dollars on putting network infrastructure in on your own right. Another kind of area where this whole global system user performance and latency plays a key part is the actual front end strategy that our customers choose, and we often help and guide them in there. When you look at remote desktop technologies or Windows Terminal Services, that's obviously been around for a while, and SAP published quite a lot of notes in the old days about how to configure them, how to size them. Windows Virtual Desktop, Azure Front Door, Bastion Host, these are all kind of evolutions of the old RDP client, but that allows you to run your front end right next to, for example, your SAP system. And then you can use some of these accelerating and caching technologies just to stream the graphics across to the end user rather than have that very interactive round trip of the SAP application server. One of the other technologies that I'm personally very fond of is Azure Application or Azure AD Application Proxy or App Proxy as it's known. This basically allows you to securely proxy any SAP application running in a browser to any device, anywhere, by using Azure Active Directory seamless single sign-on to SAP. Very cool technology that, and I have a few customers where we've implemented that to great success. So I hope this has given you guys a little bit of an overview of what the first blog was all about. It was just to summarize, there are a couple of criteria that you need to look at when you decide where you want to run your SAP system on Azure. And then there's a couple of technologies and tools where Microsoft actually invests into, and then that really eases and improves that user experience for our customers. I'll pause here and just see if there are any questions, and then I'll take blog number 2.
Yeah, maybe those Azure backbone. It's a Microsoft backbone, a Microsoft network between in order to, isn't it, to guarantee the good performance, dedicated network, not going over between the regions, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yes. So we've got hundreds and thousands of miles of dark fiber spanning the globe. A great example was a joint venture between Facebook and Microsoft not too long ago. The Mariah cable spanning the Atlantic from the US into Europe after the original, I guess, cabling was saturated. So yeah, it's always trying to bridge the gap between continents and make it a truly global world. So yeah, that Microsoft backbone is a key advantage for us. And now we've got customers able to actually use that as a service simply by peering networks or by subscribing to Azure Virtual WAN. It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I think it's what you mentioned is also very important to understand when we are building our regions. Yeah, so it's simply data center inside, and of course all of us are dreaming that we always get some greenfield and just build it, but it's not the case because you cannot get it so easily. And some of our data center, we can say, are more or less equal to each other from setup perspective, physical setup, but most of them are completely different. Yeah, and if we are now want in existing region build another data center, we are facing that we don't have any more physical place there. We don't have enough power. So this is very challenging. And what we are trying to provide is always the same feeling for the customer. But what you mentioned is very important, that customer also understand that we don't have all services in all regions, yeah? And also we don't have immediately new services in all regions. We have so-called hero regions when we are deploying the first version of the services and then to other regions.
Yeah, I'm just thinking aloud, kind of if you would in the past implement everything, something like distributed data center, build it, connect the VNets. I mean, it's such a work, and here you just do a few clicks, click, and you're set and up and running. It's just, I mean, globally, amazing. Yeah. Globally,
yeah.
Exactly.
And with this, we have different challenges. Like, what region should we choose now? I mean, we can still later on migrate, but I think obviously, now the new question is, which region should I select?
That's a great cue, because I have an answer for you for that one, or at least I can give you a framework to help you choose that region. And I'll take over here very quickly and show you guys. 1 second. So when it comes to choosing your Azure region, I've developed this analysis matrix, and I'll talk through it a little bit. So this is posted in my second blog. But how this works is if I look at Azure products by region. This is a very handy site if you want to start looking at, for example, what virtual machines are available in a region. So for this example, I've just listed 2 regions in Australia. Australia East Sydney and Australia South East is Melbourne, and I'm searching for virtual machines. Now, I know that my SAP HANA virtual machines will be running on M-series virtual machines, and I can scroll all the way down to see that in Australia East and in Australia Southeast, I have both M-Series and M-Series version 2 machines available. Now, in my hypothetical case, in the blog, Contoso Limited had an initial requirement to start off with a 3 terabyte S4HANA instance, but they knew they were going to grow to about 6 terabyte in 2 or 3 years, which means that for them, their SAP building blocks that I talked about earlier on needed to have both M-Series and M-Series V2 generally available in that region. So I start off with looking at all of our regions across the world, and then I evaluate them whether they are essentially SAP capable or not. So for the blog in the fictitious environment, I've basically created a short list of regions that I'm going to evaluate because, for example, I'm not going to choose France Central because there is no SAP capabilities in there. That kind of then feeds about 4 geos and 8 Azure regions where I can do that evaluation on. There's a couple of criteria that we score on for this, and as I said, look, things like business continuity might be quite important for customers. Azure backbone latencies could be very important, especially if you're looking at network peering and virtual WAN. End user latencies also very important. I brought in the concept of user density, which means basically if I have got a big user base in Australia, I would typically want to have my systems closer to my bigger user base. So I'll score the large user densities a little bit better. And then, of course, as everybody works in their business cases, cost of ownership is key. How I go about, after I've defined my region scope, I'm going to start doing some unit scoring for each of these technologies or each of these regions. And for example, my locations would be things like Seattle, Singapore, New York, and Frankfurt. And I'll have in Asia, not too many users. I've got quite a lot of users in the Americas, and then a handful of users in Europe and Australia. So based on kind of percentages, I'm giving those user bases or user density scores. And at the same time, I look at these Azure inter-region latencies. But now this is a little bit of magic that has to occur because it's unfortunately a manual activity. Just wanted to show you guys that Microsoft publishes all of the inter-region latency statistics. Now this is way too small to see on a screen, but basically it says that from Australia Central to Australia Central 2, there's 2 milliseconds latency between 2 VMs in those regions. So that gives us a great indication of how close those regions are. And the ratification there is that if you want to piggyback off the Microsoft backbone, then those inter-regency latencies is going to be awesome for us. We want to keep them as low as possible. So I go through a long process and I kind of transpose all of those statistics that is published on a monthly basis, and I bring them into a matrix, and I have a little bit of a weighting that says if the Azure backbone latency is more than 180 milliseconds, it scores red. Similarly, less than 180 scores yellow, and that gets 2 points, etc., etc. Then I do a whole lot of counting and see which regions have got the most red, yellow, and green, and I've got a weighting that says I will score each region as follows. At the end of this mathematical exercise, I identify my top 2, my middle range, and my bottom range, and I give them a color. That then feeds back into my total evaluation criteria here, where I can score them in their unit scores. The end user latency is quite interesting because this takes a lot of effort from the customer and implementation partner teams, where you actually go and from a user location in each of these offices, then you call up, for example, azurespeed.com and you start measuring what those latencies are. What I do here is I take an average end user latency and again color code them based on the ranges top, middle, and low. Once I've color-coded those regions, they go back into my analysis model, and then I basically score a few points here. Interesting to note that you'll see that my Asia regions in the cost of ownership score a bit lower than, for example, the US regions and European regions, as I explained a little bit earlier. So once I've got the unit scores, I work with the customer and say, okay, how important is business continuity, backbone latencies, end user latencies, density, and cost of ownership to you? Very interactively, we can decide and agree that medium, high, or low importance or weighting. They then get a multiplier, and we simply multiply the unit scores by the significance factor, and we get our true scores for our regions. The way we look at this is not a mandate, but this is an invitation to investigate further and do a last bit of diligence before you choose your region. Great example of this is input to a business case. As you can see here, for our Contoso fictitious customer, our US regions has scored best. It's probably no surprise, because they outscore on the units everywhere else in terms of proximity to their biggest user base. The latencies from the US to Europe is better. The latency from US to Asia is better. If you go from Asia to Europe, that's probably not as good. So it all makes sense if you start understanding how it looks like under the cover. But fundamentally, we've got a weighted scoring solution here, and this fictitious customer obviously can choose their top scoring region. Interestingly enough, in this matrix and decision making process, I've brought in the data sovereignty override, because that's important, and our customers need to understand that if you've got a policy or you've got legislation from a country or a geo-specific entity that says you cannot access data from this location or store data in that location, it has to be able to override even cost. So that's why I built this into our case, and in the blog you'll see that data security policies for Contoso says they are not allowed to really use a data center in Asia. Therefore, we invoke the data sovereignty override for these, and no longer is our geo of Asia Pacific with Hong Kong and Singapore a viable option for us to run. We can still run in Australia, the US, and Europe, and that's where our winning regions become the default pair of East US and West US. So yes, as I said, there's a lot of things we need to think about when we choose our region, but it doesn't stop there. It's also what can Microsoft do to help you realize that global dream and facilitate your users through ease of access, and of course to make sure your business processes that are integrating across a cloud and hybrid model still work very fast and in real time.
Excellent.
That's really great, and I think I just want to highlight if I'm now a global corporate, and I think or a company, and I just see this and this looks great, then I know you have published the Excel sheet also on your GitHub repository, so I could go there.
Right. Absolutely. So look, it's not rocket science, but it's at least a starting point. What I'd expect to do is our customers and our partners to pick that up, to build on it, and make it something cool, right? Something they can reuse, something they can evaluate. And as I said, look, this is an invitation to use it. It's not a mandate, but it gives you some insights into how these things fit together. And often global customers would want to see, what are my options? Now we've got a great tangible way to quantify those.
Nice.
Exactly. I think this making it transparent, and that it's not only a feeling. US is probably good, but really to have some key KPIs that I can really measure and then quantify. Okay, this is I like the idea of your the density of the end users and stuff like that. So yeah, really great.
That's great. And look, we've put this in practice with one of our strategic customers already. And look, everything was pointing towards, if we take a cost-conscious approach, the West Coast of the US is probably the best. But the customer had a massive contingency of users in Asia. So at the end of the day, we decided to break the paired region model, and we're actually pairing West Coast of US with the East Coast of Japan, as an example. So there's a balance there between cost and users, and obviously veering away from technology such as ASR, which is not quite yet cross-region, but there's ways we still build that DR solution for them. So very glad to have seen that this is actually not just high-level thought, but actually put in practice. And
Nice.
we've got a really great customer that worked with us on that.
And we have VNet peering to be able to do it, right?
Exactly.
To peer everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we hear everything.
Etienne, one question. I mean, what about compliances? Are you planning to do something in similar to in direction of compliances, where I can choose the same story based on compliances?
Yeah. Look, there's a few points that I'm actually working on to try and update that, and I'll quickly give you one or two inputs into that. As we see more and more customers are adopting S/4HANA, of course, the SAP Cloud Platform, or SCP, becomes key to them. So the next version of this will have the location of SCP as a evaluation criteria, right? Although we need to figure out how the scoring will work, because through peering you can still run SCP in Europe and use the backbone, but it's clearly a big decision criteria there. And then the other point is what about those highly secure environments that are super mandated? Now we know that when we look at compliance of Microsoft.com or some of our public-facing collateral that talks about all of the country-specific regulations and things like that, any data center that adheres to the minimum, you can expect to inherit those from others. But the exception to that is things like our government data centers, our DoD data centers in Germany. I know you guys have got a very secure data center. In Australia, we've got the central regions, which is, for public sector customers, for defense and military, which is highly secure. So that's another point I'm going to bring in. But I think that the audience for that will be a little bit smaller, and that our choice of regions to evaluate, once we apply that first or second filter, will be a lot easier for customers to choose. But what I find is usually an Australian government entity is not going to run in the German sovereign cloud. So
I wonder why.
No, but I really love the idea of incorporating something like the SAP Cloud Platform, because as you said, this is becoming a more and more central piece. So it's not only about where do I run my S/4HANA system, but it's also really where's all these, the satellites like the SAP Cloud Platform. So
you're right. We're no longer just a single system running a database and an app server. It's completely extended to SaaS and PaaS offerings running all over the world. So once you start thinking about SAP Cloud Platform on Azure, it's clearly, in my view, something that slots naturally into this evaluation criteria.
Great.
Wonderful. Really useful. Yeah.
Really fantastic, Etienne. Yeah. So I think we took a lot of time from you. Thank you so much. I think that was really, really valuable. We'll definitely link to the blogs that you have mentioned. We'll link to some additional information there. But I think this was really super, super helpful. So I learned a lot. Thank you very much. I'll definitely take a look at the Excel sheet and play around with it as well. So thanks for having you. And
meine Freundin, vielen Dank. This was really great. I appreciated being on your call tonight.
Okay.
Thank you.
So next time we will have you and have everything in German, right?
All right, that's a challenge. We'll do that. Wait. Maybe we'll just use Teams to transcribe my broken English Afrikaans accent into Hochdeutsch.
Good joke.
Great.
Great. It was very nice. Yeah.
All right.
Useful.
Okay.
Have a great Friday ahead, guys, and we'll see each other soon.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.